And I'm just going to be, I've got like a Wacom tablet I'm using. I'm going to be painting over. I'm a little bit rusty with my Wacom tablet because I'm used to using an iPad, and it's a little bit, it's like an external one, so it's a bit sort of less neat the way that I draw. But yeah, we'll get started. So I've got them all sort of laid out here. I've got about 8 of them that we're going to go through. I've tried to give a reasonable balance of, some of them are, say, profiles, 2 different profiles. Some are more front on, and then we've got one from sort of a lower angle. Not too much of the back of the head. We're focusing a bit more on the face and the kind of front aspects of the skull. So we'll start with this one. I'm just going to clear these guides and make a new layer. And so this first phase, I'm just going to be using a sort of bright green sort of highlighting mark. And we're going to be sort of working, I'm going to be working between the two and just sort of mapping out major landmarks that are very useful to be aware of when you start drawing a portrait. So this is obviously a portrait in clay, but it's quite a nice, quite lively portrait. And you can see I've tried to kind of angle the skull as close as possible so that it matches sort of bottom of the chin roughly is in line with the bottom of the skull there, and sort of top of the skull here roughly in line. It also sort of makes you aware of to what extent the hair kind of adds volume to a portrait. So you know, the hair's kind of sitting quite high above the top of where the skull would be in this reference, so it'd be somewhere in there, and also the amount of width that kind of gives it the back as well relative to where that side of the jaw would be. So the sort of main things to be aware of when working with skulls, and I mentioned this a bit in the sort of promo for this course, is thinking about when looking at portrait anatomy, the sort of the major planes that make up a portrait. So when I say planes, I mean large flat areas, roughly flat areas, separate from one another. So the forehead, for instance, if I kind of draw, actually what I'm going to do is, just so this stands out a bit more, I'm going to desaturate this layer. So the forehead plane is quite a sort of obvious one. So the front of the forehead here is generally a sort of fairly blocky shape. And then it sort of angles back up, so you can sort of see that here on the skull. If I map that out at the same time, got this front flat plane that makes up the front of the skull and starts to slope back into another plane, and then slopes back sort of even further. So this is what we talk about. You hear people talk about planes quite a lot when they're teaching art. And planes are basically, if you can sort of take an area and average it out into a basic shape, that's one plane. So another example would be the nose. The sort of front of the nose will tend to be simplified into one plane. So that's the front plane of the nose, and then a sort of side plane of the nose makes up the other side. And then a sort of bottom plane of the nose we tend to add. So it's sort of simplifying this quite complex set of shapes into simpler areas of form, essentially. This is what we're going to be working with when we actually start drawing portrait drawings. The reason it's useful is it allows us to not get too caught up in kind of all these individual, say, little folds or creases within these planes, and just think of them as one big area. So we can then say, well, this large plane is going to be one value, the plane above is going to be another value, and then it's going to get gradually brighter. If you did the form workshop, so last week we did the basic form workshop, it adheres to that sort of general rule that as the sort of surface tilts more towards the light source, it gets lighter. As it moves away from the light source, it gets darker. So with these planes, say the side plane of the head, as that starts to make its way sort of sideways down to this side plane, it's going to get gradually darker, and you can see that within this little rectangle, that's a general darker tone than this front rectangle. And then as it goes further to the right, it gets darker again. So that's how we sort of use planes, use simplification in order to kind of be aware of what value something is going to be. It also helps us to start looking for symmetry, which is often very useful in a portrait. So you can see if I start to kind of wrap that form around on the left-hand side, it roughly matches this plane that we're seeing on the right-hand side. So the left-hand side matches that right-hand side. Likewise, if we start to kind of look at where this side of the head is angling down, we can look for a kind of mirror image shape that makes its way down the right-hand side. And all of that is so mirrored. So this is our kind of central section of the head, and everything mirrors on either side. So the shapes aren't exactly the same, but you can see where the forms are mirroring. And I'm just going to go back and just erase that, but I just wanted to start with a little introduction to a sort of notion of planes. In terms of anatomy, what we're going to start with all of these is looking at something people usually call a sort of keystone. So a very useful little form to look for in a portrait is this little section that sits, so it's the little chunk sort of at the center of the brow, tends to angle back, so the front of the brow is tends to be sort of at this angle, and then you get this kind of angling back, so you can sort of feel it on your own brow, the angle back down towards the bridge of the nose. And it's very useful, this little shape, because it actually connects a lot of forms together. So on the skull, I'll just draw it in on the skull as well, it sits about here, you can see that, so that's that angle back. So that's our little keystone on both of these. And on either side we've got both forms of the eye connect to this left hand side and this right hand side of it. The forehead sits on top of it, so the forehead connects to the top of it, and the nose projects out of the bottom. And that starts to give us pretty much like, say, this much of the whole portrait connects in some way to that central little point. It's useful because it's in the center of the head, so then either we can look for symmetry on either side of it, but it also connects the top and bottom forms quite effectively. Then the next thing that's sort of useful to look for is, or when we're looking at comparative sort of with this skull, the base of the nose below that. So we can see here this little point where the bone juts out of the sort of center of the nasal cavity. That will generally, or pretty much always, lines up with the center of the bottom of the nose. So you can see how that's connecting. So that's the bottom of the nose there, so that's where that little bit of bone is going to be projecting out and holding the bottom cartilage of the nose. And at the top here we can sort of see got where the bone stops on the nose, both points, and that pretty much sort of makes up those major structures of the nose. The brow then, so the top of the eye socket is the beginning of the brow, and we can see those 2 points match. So where this shadow turns down, that matches with the eye socket. Now, what's interesting to note about the eye socket is we always think of, very often when we draw eyes, we kind of think of his eyes are closed, but we're looking at some open eyes soon. We think of the eye maybe like being that much of the shape, but actually the eye occupies quite a large, or what's going on with the eye occupies a large section of the head, makes its way all the way down from the top of the brow, or kind of where the brow is relative to the forehead, all the way down, and you can see here where this cheekbone is. This whole thing is the eye socket. So that makes itself, or sort of makes its way all the way down to here. So that much space in the portrait is sort of taken up by important aspects of the eye. So if I start to kind of just sketch that in, we've got side of the eye there, that central section, and we can see that map onto him on the right hand side as well. So again, the other side of that eye socket. And we can then look for the same thing on the left-hand side. So this shape here matches that shape there, angles its way back down, and you can see that little shadow there, that's a little bit of bone exposing, and that matches this portion of the brow. That connects across, and again we've got sort of dropping down here and angling back across. Almost look like spectacles or something like that. So those are the eye sockets in this portrait, and that's a really important, I find this usually something people don't think about, but it's really important when you're drawing portraits, is how much, sort of how large the eye sockets are, the bone, sort of where those two bits of bone connect at the top and the bottom, the cheekbone down the bottom and then the brow at the top, how large they are, and the amount of the eye that we actually see is quite small. So the other thing you want to bear in mind is the actual eyeball is much larger than the portion of the eye that we actually see. So we see just the lid covering maybe about a third to a half of the eyeball, but the actual size of it is much larger, which is why this socket is so big. So the eye is much larger than what we see, and it sits in this much bigger socket. So you can see how that maps over. And you can also, so we already kind of talked about this a bit, but we've got this now sitting on top of that, this block of the forehead, and you can see how that matches on him. Then these two side planes that make their way down on both sides. And then sort of angle back. You tend to get, it kind of varies from person to person depending on where the hairline is, but very often there's quite a steep kind of angle back. So this point here, and is sort of pretty much the flat top of the head, and that roughly matches with where that hairline is on this guy. And we'll see that. So we're going to do a bunch of these so that you can start to see sort of how things work comparatively across a lot of portraits. So if it's slightly confusing at this stage, don't worry. Hopefully by the time we've done about 8 of them, it'll make a bit more sense. Yeah, but you can see, so these top planes of the head are now angling back, and that makes its way to the back of the skull there. So I'm just going to center that a bit. Then, so the nasal cavity tends to roughly line up with each side of the nose. So we don't see that right-hand side of the nose, left-hand side of the nose, but we see the right-hand side of the nose. And it would, if we were kind of drawing the skull underneath, it would sit, that cavity would sit somewhere there, and the cartilage projects forward of that. We're going to be looking at the sort of cartilage aspects of the nose in a sort of later part of this lecture, so I'm going to be kind of blocking out individual features at the end. But you get an idea sort of for how much of it is sort of cartilage. A lot of what we see of the nose is actually cartilage, and not so much of it is bone. It's usually just this first section. And you often see a kind of widening around the bony part of the nose, and then it narrows back down into the cartilage and then bulges back out. This guy is quite a big sort of nose that bulges at the bottom, the amount of cartilage. Then as we drop down, we can sort of see, so this is the bottom of his cheekbone, or bottom of the skull's cheekbone, and you can sort of see that match here. So this cheekbone shape sits about there, then makes its way back. Here would be this cavity, which is formed because the jawbone is separate from the mouth. So it's always useful to kind of be aware of the fact, particularly if you were drawing expressions. You don't often draw expressions because they tend to be a bit trickier, but the mandible or the jawbone can move, and then the top of the head is roughly fixed. So that's what allows so much kind of stretching through these parts of the flesh. Kind of this area of the face can kind of stretch open and move around, and there's most of the muscles are kind of focused around the mouth and the face. There aren't so many muscles up in the bonier portions. So the bottom of the face around the chin is bony, the top of the head is bony, but this sort of section through here where the jawbone connects to the top of the skull is a lot more flexible, so that can move around a lot. But we end up with this cavity because there's a gap in the bone, basically, and that's what I was kind of pointing out there, this kind of little gap here. We don't quite see it on this left-hand edge, but it's sort of hidden underneath the flesh on that side. So this kind of starts to give us our indication of what's going on towards the mouth. Obviously, his teeth are hidden, but his teeth are set somewhere in here in his mouth. And then we get down to bottom of the chin, roughly matches the bottom of his chin there, angles its way back up, and we'd end up with the kind of back of his jaw up here somewhere. And then the other side of the jaw, that's sort of, again, a little bit hidden up that back edge is there. And the back of his skull would be somewhere here. But there's a lot less in terms of planal changes. The whole side of the head, you can feel it on your own head, is fairly flat, sort of from this side backwards. So from about this point, sort of here, this whole side of the head will tend to be a large kind of fairly flattish plane. Not entirely, but it's pretty flat down this side, sort of from this corner. So the front of the face is one sort of flat plane that faces outwards. Then we get this kind of almost like a right angle that cuts back, a bit less than a right angle, but an angle that cuts back towards the side plane of the head. So that's all a bit simpler. It's hidden here, but his ear would sit somewhere sort of in this space, and then his other ear would be back there. And then obviously we've got his neck that sort of is slightly hidden, but that would connect down here as well, so this would be where his kind of neck is sitting. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this one. As I say, I'm going to go through a bunch of them, but that's a sort of a way of breaking down what's going on underneath the surface of this portrait. So I'm just going to delete that. Actually, I'll close it and open it back up again later.
So, as a quick practice exercise, we should get a piece of tracing paper.
Yeah, you can definitely do it with tracing paper. That's a really good one. If you like, you can use these references. As I say, I'm going to be uploading them, so you could print them off. The other thing I sometimes do, before you print them, if you take, say, this image, which I'll do next, if you kind of make them really low, make them really bright and really low contrast, that kind of often fades them out enough that if you sketch over the top of them, you don't need the tracing paper. But yeah, either way, it's quite useful to do. So yeah, did anyone have any questions after that first demo? So I'm just going to make this one desaturated as well. It's already pretty much desaturated, but
I always struggle with the eyes and the relationship of anatomy in the eyes, because that little crease you have of the eye is not the orbit.
Yeah, like this one.
Yeah, and under the eye.
Yeah.
And those are really noticeable landmarks, aren't they?
Yeah, they are.
The orbit is a mystery to me. Where is it underneath that? And why do I need to know? I don't know. As I say, I struggle with it.
Yeah, I'll try to give you some, at least my approach to the eyes, because definitely the eyes I think are the most tricky portion of the face to work with, for a number of reasons. I mean, partly because we're like really hyper designed to be very critical of, well, not critical, but we're designed to be able to look at other people's eyes and see all sorts of complexity or sort of really subtle differences. So we're probably more critical of how eyes are drawn or painted than anything that you could possibly draw or paint. So it's partly just the level of criticalness that you get from a viewer or even yourself when you look at an eye. Faces in general are like that, because I mean the fact that we can tell apart such minuscule differences in people's appearance to know that it's a totally different person is really crazy, that the way that sort of we can do that. Obviously any species can do that with themselves, but that makes it a lot harder to draw a person than to draw a tree. Obviously a tree is just as complex as a person's face, but we're not as critical of it naturally as we are with with a face. So yeah, I'll kind of go into that a little bit. So for this session, I'm going to mostly be focusing on sort of those bone structures, but you're right that I actually find this crease here and the bottom of the eye probably the most useful starting points. But it is important to be aware of their relationship, so sort of to where the brow sits over the top of them, because that's what kind of creates these extra little folds and how those shapes work once we get to them as well. But yeah, these points I always find probably these the most kind of useful starting point, and the kind of the inner and outer corners of the eyes as well, when trying to approach an eye. But yeah, mainly it's just to kind of, I like to try to get people to think of the eye occupying this much space rather than kind of focusing in on this much of it, because I think what often happens is you get those sort of almond, like too simplified eyes rather than having all the nice complex forms that surround the eye. And if you get those sort of forms in place, the eye kind of fills itself in quite nicely.
Okay.
So yeah, I'll try to speed up with this set so we can get into the features. But again, so we start looking at this little keystone shape. So again, on this side, sits in here. Then we've got the base of his nose, which is down here somewhere. Probably actually in the portrait, this nose cavity would be a bit longer. He's got quite a long nose, so it would probably sit a little bit lower. Then we've got top of the nose bone here, and you can see that I was sort of talking about a bit of a bulge. So it sort of bulges out a little bit there, narrows, and then bulges back out again, is often something that occurs with the nose, so it's something to be aware of. So we've got that nose cavity, which sits about here. Then making our way across, got the top of the brow, that socket, and then this point here, so this sort of high point on the cheekbone matches with the cheekbone here, so that's why we get this highlight before it kind of angles back down, so you often get a highlight on that cheekbone. And then it would drop down here, and that sort of angles and matches where those highlights are. They match the inner portion of the socket. We get that glasses shape again. He's got a particularly sort of clear forehead in terms of this planal stuff that's going on. So you can see very obviously kind of that corner where the forehead turns a corner and goes to where the side of the head is. On this guy, which is quite useful. So a slight angle back up to his hairline, and then that's about the point where we then get a bit more of a steep kind of shift back. So yeah, we'll go sort of maybe up to about here. His forehead's probably a bit higher than this skull, and then angling back up to this point. So got the side of the orbit there, side here. Then again, center of his mouth, which would sit somewhere behind his lips there. This gap here, which makes its way down to the jaw. And then bottom of the jawbone down there, across here, angling back up, and then the back of the jawbone makes its way up to where the ears are. And then the back of the head, on that side, and we see a little bit of it on this right hand side as well, both in the skull and the reference. So this whole section here is pretty much the side plane on the left hand side, and then we see a tiny bit, because it's almost a frontal, we see a tiny bit of the side plane on the right hand side as well. So that's where that angle is occurring. So angling back to the side of the head. You can sort of feel it again. You can feel it on your own head, the side of your face, or side of your head, that then connects to the front of the face. So the front of the face, sort of this whole section of it here, is sort of flattish, and then everything kind of angles back. That's the kind of big structure of the head that we're looking for. And then obviously his ear kind of sits out. We can kind of see a little bit of his ear on either side there. And his neck that connects. Neck tends to connect up to kind of the center point of the ear. We don't quite see it on that other side, but so his neck would be there, and there, his ears kind of coming off there, and coming off this other side as well. So that pretty much does this guy. So we'll look for maybe look for a profile for this one. So we can start to look at things. So we see a lot more of the side of the head now. So again, you can sort of see if this is the front plane of the head, starts there. This is all the sort of side plane that we were talking about, which is reasonably flat. Sits back sort of in here. So that's our side plane that we're looking at, and all of from a profile, all the features are compressed into the front plane, so it can be tricky to draw a profile for that reason. Just going to revert this. So in this instance, that little keystone that I was talking about, we only see from the side, but it's still important, and it's still a useful little landmark to work with. We obviously don't have any symmetry when we're working from a profile, because the symmetry occurs from this center line that we're looking at is where everything is kind of mirrored. So we're just seeing one side of the mirror, basically. So we've got this center mark, and we can just about make out where this highlight is in the drawing matches the positioning of the orbit. So it's kind of nice to look at this one because it gives you a slightly different angle of what we've been looking at. We're looking at this side of the eye, where the high point is of the cheekbone, how that sort of curves back up to the orbit on either side. So that's where that cavity, that space is. We've then got the shape of the top of the nose that angles out there, and we can see a bit more clearly, because we're looking from the side, where this little shape at the base of the nose, that little bone that sticks out at the base of the nose, curves back up. And also how much, so this is how much of the nose is all sort of cartilage. But it also shows that where the cartilage connects to is where this nose cuts back in. And also how far back from, say, the front peak of the point of the nose, how far back the nose cuts in. Something people often do is they kind of put the back of the nose too close to the front of the face. Actually, similarly, the eye sits quite far back, so people often have trouble when drawing in profile because they kind of push all the features really close to the front of the face. But it's worth noting how kind of far in from this front side of the face, the front of the face, that the features actually sit. So yeah, this is our nose cavity here. Then this angles back. We've got slightly different on this guy, but a bulge for where the teeth are, and then an angle back in for the base of the chin. And then the jaw, which angles back up and up here. So we see a little bit of it. These sort of softer forms indicate, and they also show they kind of angle back up to this cavity here, which is where the ear connects. So that's where the ear canal can make its way in. So yeah, that's the bottom of his jaw. We can't see it super clearly on the surface of this drawing, but this little gap would sit about there, and so then his teeth would be in somewhere in about this point, and then these other forms of the jawbone, and a little bit, so this bottom of the cheekbone as well, which connects back up to the nose there. So you can sort of see how these structures underneath would be laying in. Then we've got his neck, which connect about here, so you can sort of see where his neck would be connecting, back of the head. And again, we can get a bit simpler once we get sort of to the side plane. The front plane, we do see a little bit of the front plane of his forehead. So this is the center of the forehead there. A little bit of this plane, which then makes its way all the way back. And then this becomes sort of from about here is the side plane, sort of running through there. So we're mostly looking at the side plane of the head. So this would be top of the head, and then that's the side plane. And that can all connect up. So yeah, that sort of shows how those same forms viewed from the side function. And it's useful because being able to see it from multiple sides helps quite a lot, rather than always looking at things kind of front on or exactly the same position. It allows you to kind of think about things a bit more, the whole kind of outside of the skull and how it works from different angles. What are we on? Yeah, we're doing right for time. So the next one I'll do, another kind of interesting one, is this sort of looking from below. And we'll try to kind of pick out again the same shapes looking from below. So can find this keystone again this time. And then we can see base of the nose here. And top of the bone of the nose, kind of before the cartilage, where that would drop down to show the cavity. Then the brow again, top of that socket. And top of the cheekbone. So top of the cheekbone will line up with that highlight. You can only see a tiny bit of it on the left-hand side of the sky. Actually, it's probably be a little bit lower even looking at the skull. So yeah, about where that angle back occurs, that's where the highlight is going to be. So on the side of the socket there, and we can see really clearly how this form here matches to this side and this view. So that gives us our, kind of pop this one in as well. That gives us our orbits. Then the center of the mouth, which viewed from this angle would be a little bit kind of curving back because we're looking up at it rather than straight on. The teeth will tend to be straight. Then dropping down to the bottom of the jaw. And angling back up. So we've got that side, the front. This cavity would sit hidden in this guy. And then the front planes of the forehead again. This is sort of the turning point. So you can see there's a highlight there, then a darker tone. That's where that front plane turns, the forehead. And then we only see a tiny bit of the next plane. After that, it's sort of hidden in this one because we're looking so far from below, from kind of well below. So we've got this front plane, then angle back. Again, this space here is roughly where the ear would connect. Slightly different anatomy, this guy, to the skull, but you can sort of see how it would roughly work. The neck, which sits about here, and then a lot of the flesh of the neck, so it looks quite different, but it's because the neck skin is sort of stretched up to the bottom of his chin. So that means that what we actually see down here is more of the skin, and then the bone would be angling back in underneath you can sort of feel it on your own jaw, but angles back in, and it's got a cavity behind it. So this bit here, we're seeing the bone pronounce, and then it angle back because of the skin gets stretched basically, and creates a sort of softer angle back down to the neck. So that's what we're looking at from that side. And then the back, so back of his head sits probably somewhere about, actually maybe not that far back, getting tricked by his hair, probably about here, and then back of his skull would be about there. And we end up again with this sort of line that runs down here. This is the side of the head, side plane of the head. So that's where it sort of turns a corner, and then we sort of see it's mirrored on the other side that we can see again. So those shapes there, all along there, they sort of mirror each other from that center line. It's important to be aware of this angle back, because you very often get quite a sort of severe tonal change at that point, or if it's lit from the side in any way, that's where you'll get your highlights, or that's where you'll get your shadows, sort of shadow edges begin, which we'll be talking about a little bit more next week. But yeah, that pretty much does it for this guy.